that's what I was supposed to do after we finished the music, and I forgot to do it. But I've done it now, so I'll just, for the sake of the recording, note that this is for Friday, September 19, 2025. And I think we're about prepared to start here. And well, I'll tell you what, I'll go into where we are and what we're doing once we get started. Let's bow our heads and begin. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings to us. We thank you that we have the written word, and we thank you that we have the opportunity to go about life, and we have the technology to expand our horizons and to know things that people wouldn't have been able to know even 20, 30 years ago, because we have access to information so readily. We want to use these things, however, to your glory, and that means that we reflect your glory in our own lives and characters. So we ask that as we open the written word this evening, that each individual might receive an outpouring of the Holy Spirit that prepares them to receive the message you have for them. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, last week we got through most of the book of Nehemiah, except for the last chapter. And we'd gotten through a number of chapters pretty quickly, but this last chapter has some things in that I wanted to spend some time on. I wanted us to have a little chance to absorb and look at. And this is perhaps the chapter that best illustrates Nehemiah as the original Pharisee. That the Pharisees owe their worldview and their approach to devotion to the Creator to this man and his approach to life and to what the Jewish religion ought to be. And so here we are, chapter 13. This version titles it Nehemiah's Various Reforms. And so we begin where he says, and this thing has changed my font. Where do I, font size. There we go. I want large. Yeah. Hopefully that'll be a little bit easier for you to see. On that same day, and he's talking about all the ceremonies and so forth that we read about before, as the book of Moses was being read to the people, the passage was found that said that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be permitted to enter the assembly of God. Footnote A, see Deuteronomy 23, 3-6. And I don't know that I'll go back there, but I'm going to give you a little additional information about it. For they had not provided the Israelites with food and water in the wilderness. Instead, they hired Balaam to curse them, though our God turned the curse into a blessing. When this passage of the law was read, all those of foreign descent were immediately excluded from the assembly. Well, first of all, they jumped to a conclusion. Second of all, they made an overbroad exclusion. They're excluding everyone of foreign descent, not just Moabites and Ammonites. Now, they didn't get into all of the rule that was written down for them. The people of foreign ancestry would have to wait 3 generations until they entered the assembly. However, Ammonites and Moabites had to wait 10 generations. So yes, they were excluded for 10 generations from entering the assembly of God. But by this point, more than 10 generations has passed. I mean, 10 generations, what is that? About 250, 300 years? I mean, it's been well over 1,500 years. So, yeah, I think they kind of jumped to conclusions here, didn't read everything, went off half charged, half informed, I should say, fully charged, but only half informed. What's the saying? Be sure brain is engaged before putting mouth in gear. Maybe you need to make sure that you put your brain, you engage your brain before you charge off and do things and make decisions without full information. Anyway, that's what they did. And exactly who initiated that, Nehemiah doesn't say. We know Ezra was there as well. Before this had happened, Eliashib the priest, who had been appointed as supervisor of the storerooms of the temple of our God, and who was also a relative of Tobiah, in case you've forgotten, Tobiah was one of the opponents of rebuilding the wall, Sanballat and Tobiah, plus an Arab, all engaged in this opposition. Well, now the priest has converted a large storage room and placed it at Tobiah's disposal. The room had previously been used for storing grain offerings, the frankincense, various articles for the temple, and the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil, which were prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, as well as the offerings for the priests. So, for whatever purpose, this Eliashib, how he's a relative to Tobiah isn't said, but it's probably by marriage, and you'll see why I say that here in a little bit, gives him one of the storerooms at the temple, which means that the stuff that's supposed to have been stored there got displaced. I was not in Jerusalem at that time, for I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. Now, why he says Babylon there, I'm not sure. He probably wasn't in Babylon, although he may have had used Nebuchadnezzar's buildings as a palace, since they now had control of it. But he was the king of Susa, the king of all the Medo-Persian Empire. Anyway, and also now, for the 32nd year of his reign, footnote B, King Artaxerxes of Persia is here identified as the king of Babylon because Persia had conquered the Babylonian Empire. The 32nd year of Artaxerxes was 433 BC or BCE, depending on how you want to put it. So, and to help you place that, when Nehemiah first asked permission to go and help the people of Jerusalem rebuild the city and its wall, he that was in the 20th year of this King Artaxerxes. So he was there apparently for 12 years. And then he went back and served again as cupbearer for a period of time. How long, we don't know. And then he says, when I arrived back in Jerusalem, doesn't tell us when that is, I learned about Eliashib's evil deed in providing Tobiah with a room in the courtyards of the temple of God. I became very upset and threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. Then I demanded that the rooms be purified, and I brought back the articles for God's temple, the grain offerings, and the frankincense. Now, you might get a picture of that, throwing all his things out of the room. If you're familiar with landlord-tenant things, if a tenant gets evicted, they have X amount of time to leave the premises. If they don't, and I don't know how often this happens, I'm guessing not very often, but I've seen video of it happening. If they don't get out, then by a certain time, they have the writ of eviction. They call the sheriff's department. The sheriff comes and forcibly removes the people and sets all their stuff out on the sidewalk or on the street. And they're removed forcibly from where they'd been living. And so that's kind of the picture now you get here when Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem and finds out that Tobiah is living in one of the storerooms in the temple. He kind of blows a gasket, and he goes in there and forcibly removes the guy. Now, whether he used force against Tobiah himself or whether he just had somebody haul all that stuff out and who knows where he put it, he says he threw them out of the room, whatever that means. And then he restores the room to what he believed its purpose should be. I also discovered that the Levites had not been given their prescribed portions of food, so they and the singers who were to conduct the worship services had all returned to work their fields. Well, yeah, you need food. You got to eat to live, right? If the people aren't bringing you the food, you got to go back to the fields and farm, yeah. I immediately confronted the leaders and demanded, "Why has the temple of God been neglected?" Then I called all the Levites back again and restored them to their proper duties. And once more all the people of Judah began bringing their tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the temple storerooms. I assigned supervisors for the storerooms: Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah, one of the Levites. And I appointed Hanan, son of Zaccur, and grandson of Mattaniah, as their assistant. These men had an excellent reputation, and it was their job to make honest distributions to their fellow Levites. That sounds like something he'd done, then he has to come back and do it over because the people kind of backslid on him. Now notice that this next verse is inset a little bit, because this is not part of the narrative. This is a separate comment by Nehemiah, formed in the words of prayer. Remember this good deed, O my God, and do not forget all that I have faithfully done for the temple of my God and its services. Now, why did he throw this in here? Well, we'll talk about that. Let's read on. In those days I saw men of Judah treading out their wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys, and bringing their wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of produce to Jerusalem to sell on the Sabbath. So I rebuked them for selling their produce on that day. Some men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise. They were selling it on the Sabbath to the people of Judah, and in Jerusalem at that. So I confronted the nobles of Judah. "Why are you profaning the Sabbath in this evil way?" I asked. "Wasn't it just this sort of thing that your ancestors did that caused our God to bring all this trouble upon us and our city?" I sense a bit of misdirection here. Yes, the people of Judah did ignore God from time to time, and sometimes they didn't worship him the way they should have, the way he had specified for them. And that may have had some influence in what happened. But ultimately, Judah went into exile for its arrogance. They would have been allowed to live in Judah if their king had just sent the tribute that Nebuchadnezzar required. He would have let them live on in Judah. Just send me a little tribute and everything's cool. You can live the way you want to live. You can worship the way you want to worship. Just send me some tribute and I'll have my troops available to protect you if anybody, should threaten you. Well, it should have been a very good deal for them, but they had this idea of Jewish. There's a term, but maybe I shouldn't use it because it gets used here in the United States. That they are a special people and they deserve to be totally independent and self-sovereign, and they shouldn't have to pay tribute to anybody. And so these kings kept rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, and so eventually he came and wiped out just about everybody, hauled them off to Babylon or killed them or, whatever he did. And he got the last king, Zedekiah, killed his sons right there in front of him. And then after he'd witnessed that, he had his eyes put out so that he couldn't see anymore. It was a vicious time, obviously, and that's what kings did. They could be very cruel, vindictive, and if you were king, you'd get away with whatever came to mind. So if you had that evil bent of mind, that's what you did. But the point I'm making is that Nehemiah here is saying, well, you went into exile because you weren't keeping the Sabbath right. There might be an element of truth to that, but for the most part, it was just their arrogance. And Nehemiah is going to some extent, double down on that arrogance. I mean, by excluding all the foreigners, we're very special. We can't let foreigners be part of our special group, so on and so forth. And so now he sees this Sabbath thing going on, and he puts a stop to it. Now you are bringing even more wrath upon Israel by permitting the Sabbath to be desecrated in this way. That's verse 8, last part of verse 18. Then I commanded that the gates of Jerusalem should be shut as darkness fell every Friday evening, or the evening before Sabbath, not to be opened until the Sabbath ended. I sent some of my own servants to guard the gates so that no merchandise could be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and tradesmen, with a variety of wares, camped outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I spoke sharply to them and said, "What are you doing out here camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. Shades of the war on drugs. America, well, all the world, but America also has a drug problem. And drugs make workers unsuitable to work. In fact, most employers have what's called a fitness to work policy, and that policy is the policy that says you can't expect to work here if you're going to do drugs. People do drugs and go to work, and some of them get away with it, some of them don't, some of them get fired for their drugs. But that's the policy the company has. When I went to work in industry here where we live, well, 25 miles away, one of the first things I had to do was go to the doctor's office and urinate in a cup. And that was sent in, there was no problems. And they reserved the right to do random testing. Just all of a sudden call somebody in, all right, go over there to the doctor's office and take this cup with you, kind of thing. I remember one time there was a forklift incident. A guy was operating a forklift, moving materials out of trucks into the plant. And as he was doing so, the upper radiator hose on the forklift engine blew up, gave way, and shot hot, steaming water all over things, including the part of his sitting place that was exposed to the back side of the forklift. And he got up real quick and was screaming and dragging himself along the cold floor trying to deal with the pain. Well, now you've got an incident. He's going to need medical care. While he was in medical care, he got tested and he wasn't clean and he lost his job. I remember the forklift mechanic being rather upset at the whole incident because he wanted to know what he'd done wrong, that he hadn't caught that bad radiator hose, replaced it before it caused a problem for somebody. He was a diligent and a person of integrity, I believe. At some point, he quit doing the job, and I think, he gave other reasons for it, but I think that incident may have been part of it. Is it was too much for him to bear that, I've got this responsibility, and people can get hurt if I don't do my job right. But anyway, because of all that, then the government at some point said, well, we've got to crack down on drugs. And their idea was, well, let's just make it so that they don't come into the country. So they make the drugs illegal. They make bringing them into the country illegal. Of course, now we've got to put up all sorts of controls at our borders. And they don't work. The drugs come in anyway. People transport drugs all the time. If you watch police videos on YouTube, you'll see a lot of instances where they pull somebody over for something ridiculous like following too closely or not signaling a lane change or something like that. Then they search the vehicle with a dog and they find drugs, and they seize the vehicle and the drugs and any cash they find. That's what the laws allow. It's a rather draconian policy, and it doesn't work. And what we've done is we've created a market for organized crime to make scads of money, because if you outlaw it, well, that just makes it all that much more valuable, and people will pay to get it. And so organized crime can make a lot of money by providing these drugs and sneaking them across the border into the United States. So we've created all our own headaches. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have done this. I'm just saying it doesn't work. And this is kind of the approach now that Nehemiah is taking here. If we could find a way to dry up the demand for drugs so that people weren't trying to find them and weren't buying them, the cartels would be out of business. They're not going to go to all the trouble of trying to get things across the border if they can't sell the goods once they get them into the country. But we haven't figured out how to do that. And that's kind of the conundrum that faces Nehemiah. The sensible thing for him to do is just to convince the Jews not to buy anything on Sabbath. So, if the vendors show up and they set up all their stuff and they spend all day there and sell nothing, you're not going to keep wasting your time there and not get any sales. That's the obvious, sensible thing to do. But if you can't do that, if you don't have the power to change the minds of the people who are doing the buying, well, you go after the people who are doing the selling. There's fewer of them. And so he does that. And when they camp outside the wall, because he won't let them through the gates, he goes out there and he threatens them. I want to read that because I got a little different impression than from how the NIV puts it. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates, so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you." Okay, so this version has done an interpretation to that and suggests I'll arrest you. But and he spoke sharply. He went out there and kind of razzed them out. Spoke, chewed them out. Read them a lecture, kind of like. Then, let's see. And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. And then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and to guard the gates in order to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath. Remember this good deed also, O my God. Have compassion on me according to your great and unfailing love. About the same time, I realized that some of the men of Judah had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Furthermore, half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or of some other people and could not speak the language of Judah at all. Well, remember the German saying Küche, Kinder, Kirche, essentially kitchen, children, and church. That was the role of women at one time, and certainly back this far, men, I'm sure, had some interaction with their children, but raising the children was left to the women. So if you married a foreign woman and she raised her children and she was used to her own language and maybe wasn't that good with your language, she would probably raise her children to speak her language. So I confronted them, I assume he's talking about the men here, and called down curses on them. I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. I made them swear in the name of God that they would not let their children intermarry with the pagan people of the land. Wasn't this exactly what led King Solomon of Israel into sin? Well, yeah, his foreign wives were an influence, but so was his intellectual arrogance a problem, and that's partly why he ended up going astray until later in his life. So, like I say, the women had an influence, but they weren't the only influence. They weren't the only cause of it. There was no king from any nation who could compare to him, and God loved him and made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by his foreign wives and other things, but How could you even think of committing a sinful deed and acting unfaithfully toward God by marrying foreign women? And of course, remember the language of Ezra, polluting the holy race by intermarrying. One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, had married a daughter of Sanballat the Horonite. Now this is why if Eliashib was related to Tobiah, it was probably through some sort of marriage, because now we find that his grandson has married a daughter of Sanballat. And Nehemiah says, "So I banished him from my presence. Remember them, O my God, for they have defiled the priesthood and the solemn vows of the priests and Levites." Focus here on purity. "So I purged out everything foreign and assigned tasks to the priests and Levites, making certain that each knew his work. I also made sure that the supply of wood for the altar and the first portions of the harvest were brought at the proper times. Remember this in my favor, O my God." Now, let's talk about those insertions here. Up here in verse 14, again in the middle of verse 22, or at the end of it, verse 29, and then the last sentence of verse 31. Nehemiah has stepped out of narration and spoken these prayers, and all of them begin with remember. Remember this good deed. Is he preaching salvation by works? Is he thinking he can commend himself to God, that God will treat him favorably because he's done these good things? And why is he so focused on this? I mean, he keeps throwing it in here. Is it possible that Nehemiah had a guilty conscience? I mean, up here at verse 14, he had just thrown out Tobiah out of the storeroom and made the people go back to providing for the priests and Levites. Then here in verse 22, he had just threatened some people, threatened to lay hands on them if they didn't quit showing up on Sabbath. Then down here in verse 29, he banished the grandson of the high priest. And it also, if you read a little bit earlier, beat some men and pulled out their hair. That's painful. And probably kind of bloody too. So he's doing these things, and there's something at the back of his skull telling him this doesn't reflect the character of the Creator. God wouldn't approach these problems the way you have. Yeah, but God, I did it. I did it to do these good things. Remember me for the good things, oh my God. That's one possible understanding for why he keeps throwing that in. Now, he's done it before, but particularly here in this last chapter. And those are his final reforms. And there are people who will tell you that Nehemiah was a model reformer. So, the church today needs to get harsh with people and maybe even get physically violent with them so that we can get the reforms we need so that God will look on us with favor. Friends, you're human. God created you. God looks on you with favor. Doesn't matter how you behave. He doesn't like it when you behave poorly. But he doesn't like it because he has favor for you, and he sees that what you're doing is destroying and ultimately killing you. And he wants you to have a good life. He wants you to have joy, and he wants you to have that joy abundantly. So you don't have to do good deeds to commend yourself to God and earn his favor. You already have his favor. Now, new book. Book of Esther. The people in our family, the children in our family, were given Bible names. My mother didn't have one, my dad didn't really have one, but all of us, except for one sort of, were given Bible names. So, I don't normally disclose my first name, but I am named after a Bible character. I normally use my middle name because my first name is so common that it's hard to tell who's hollering if somebody's hollering for me. If they use the name I use now, it's pretty certain they're talking to me. A lot more certain than if I had that other name, used that other name. So, yeah, I use my middle name for that reason. My brother, Daniel Harvey. Daniel's obvious Bible name. After him, there was a girl, and they named her Rona. Now, Rona specifically is not a Bible name, but it's only one letter different from Rhoda, the girl who heard Peter at the door and forgot to open it for him. So that was that one. Then after that, the twins were born. And so the girl got the name Esther. And then she was named after a young lady who was babysitting us, Lorraine. And then, since the boy was a twin, they wanted to have a similar name for him. They picked Lester and gave him the middle name Lauren. So you had Esther Lorraine and Lester Lauren, the twins. So Lester's not a Bible name. It was picked to go with the Bible name that my sister got. And that's the name Esther. And then my youngest brother, he got the name Jonathan, which is significant if you know what my first name is. But anyway. So, yeah, I have a sister named after the person in this story. Now, this book gets ragged on some of the time because God does not get mentioned in this book. Now, people will tell you, and I'm not going to argue with them, that the hand of God is visible in this book, but he's not explicitly mentioned. Nor is prayer. They talk about fasting, but we talk about fasting and praying, so a lot of people assume that the fasting that they did involved prayer as well, but this book doesn't say that. Now, there's a possibility that the author prepared this book for a secular audience, and that's why God isn't mentioned. And it ended up being included in the biblical canon because it relates a story, an important story, about the preservation of Judah and ultimately the preservation of the line that would bring Jesus to this earth. Because Jesus was born a Jew. If the Jews had been wiped out at the time described in this story, God would have had to make some other kind of arrangement to bring Jesus to this earth. So this then becomes important just in that context. So let's get into it, and most of you probably are familiar with the story. Well, let's read through it and see if we might run across something that we didn't notice before. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. We've already crossed over 2 footnotes there. The Hebrew says Ahasuerus, which is another name for Xerxes, also throughout the book of Esther. Xerxes reigned 486 to 465 BC, which would make this story taking place before the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah that we just finished reading. But it's placed here anyway. Hebrew will say to Cush instead of Ethiopia. And so let's just keep going. At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days. Tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. Now, this is just the 3rd year, and he's going to put on a celebration that's close to half a year long. Very nearly 6 months here. Lots of food, lots of pomp and display, and probably a lot of very empty but high-sounding words. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Very opulent description. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. So they've built something that's opulent, attractive. This is a way, these things were expensive, it's a way to show off your wealth. And when you're the ruler of a good portion of the world, and you can extract whatever taxes you want because you're an absolute sovereign and a dictator, yeah, you're gonna have all the wealth, and you can put on all kinds of display. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. Do you imagine that there was some excess taking place? Some people got stewed and unable to walk straight. Uh, that's the picture that's being played out for us here. All this drinking, no limit. Come to the bar and have all you want. It's free. It's on the house. Drink whatever you like. We're not going to stop you. At the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the seventh day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, read, he was drunk out of his skull, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Well, it's very easy to get furious when you're drunk. We've talked about this before. The alcohol is a nervous system suppressant. It's a downer. It shuts things down. And if you drink enough, it'll turn off certain levels of your brain, including those levels that you use to present an image to the world around you, the image that you want the world to see, of the mask, shall we say. And when you get drunk, that mask falls off, and now you act like what you're really like on the inside. And so here is King Xerxes, stewed out of his skull, and now we see what he's really like. He wants his wife to come out and strut her stuff, and she refuses, and he gets angry. He immediately consulted with his wise advisors. Makes me think of the common alcoholic beverage in the United States that starts with Bud. You probably know what I mean. In fact, we even referred to it just by Bud, particularly if it's the light version. But the full name is something else, and I used to call it Bud Dumber, because I says the stuff that they sell doesn't make anybody any wiser. Anyway, so he's talking to his wise advisors, except that there's been an open bar for 7 days. I don't think they're in a condition to actually offer any true wisdom. At any rate, they knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked their advice. The names of these men were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, 7 nobles of Persia and Media. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly sent through his eunuchs? Memucan answered the king and his nobles. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. Well, what does this tell you about the marriages being represented by these wise advisors? Well, it was not a marriage of mutual respect. Because if it was, it wouldn't bother them. They would have given their wives the freedom to make up their own minds about things. And if the wife didn't obey, well, I wish you would. Sometime we'll sit down and talk about it, but, she's her own person. She has to make up her own mind. But they're afraid here. They're really afraid because they know that the culture and tradition that's been handed down by a highly patriarchal society, which was essentially the whole world at that time, demanded that women be subject to their husbands so their husbands could do things to their women that women wouldn't allow if they had a choice. So you don't dare let the women have choice. And now here this woman, a prominent woman, the queen, the wife of the king himself, has just asserted her independence and refused to obey the order of the king. Well, we can't have this. If she does it, all the women will do it. And none of us have marriages based on mutual respect. We all have marriages based on the man being the boss and being in charge. We would lose our position of authority and our ability to be in charge and to control our wives if this were to stand. So we have to do something to stop it. We read that. I got down. Okay. So, if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect, in other words, fear, from their wives. The king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so he followed Memucan's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province, in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases, or should speak in the language of his own people, whatever. And I'm looking at the clock because, okay, we're okay for now. So, the men have gotten together and conspired to keep their women subject to them and dependent on them. And this woman who dared to assert her independence, they apparently didn't choose to execute her, but they did banish her from the queen's presence, the king's presence. From there on out, she would no longer be his wife, obviously. They wouldn't be able to approach him to have any marital relations. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. So his personal attendant suggested, "Let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king." Now, whether they were all exactly virgins or not, who knows? May not have mattered that much. The term may just mean young women. Find a bunch of beautiful young women who aren't married, preferably. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice was very appealing to the king. I wonder why. So he put the plan into effect. I mean, you're the king. You can do what you want. Nobody can tell you can't do something. So if you want to call in all the beautiful young women of the kingdom and consort with them and then pick one to be your new queen, Well, hey, that's a whole lot of fun. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Of course he would. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. So he's anciently descended from the family of Saul. His family had been among those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, that would be the second time that Nebuchadnezzar went to Jerusalem and took captives back to Babylon with him. The first time was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's father, Jehoiakim, K-I-M. And Jehoiakim had been Eliakim, and Pharaoh Necho had deposed his brother Jehoiah something, I forget exactly. Jehoash, that's not it. It's anyway, deposed his brother and put him in place. He was a little bit older anyway. And then he reigned for 11 years and died at a young age. And his son, Jehoiakim, became king. About 3 months later, Nebuchadnezzar showed up and says, no, we're not going to do it this way. And he took Jehoiakim's uncle Mattaniah, named him Zedekiah, and put him in as king. He might have been better off with Jehoiakim, but we don't know. But it's what Nebuchadnezzar did. It's what Nebuchadnezzar thought was the right thing for him to do. Not the right thing for Judah, the right thing for Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure he thought that way. At any rate, so you have Daniel and possibly Ezekiel, who went to Babylon that first time at the beginning of King Jehoiakim's reign, or in the 3rd year of his reign, rather. And then you have people, possibly Ezekiel, we're not certain, but other people also taken captive at this point. And Mordecai's family was among those. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. Both names, as I recall, mean about the same thing, Hadassah being Hebrew and Esther being Aramaic. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, were brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hegai's care. Hegai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. Well, he was supposed to do that for all of them, but he probably did a little something special for her because he liked her for whatever reason. Well, remember, he's a eunuch, so he's not messing with these ladies. So he picks them out for whatever reasons suit him, who knows. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So, sounds to me like Hegai is trying to steer the kingdom by choosing the next king. Apparently, it worked. So, you use the tools you have at your disposal to get what you want. And he apparently succeeded at some level of that. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. People have speculated why he did that. Uncertain. There likely was a level of, well, we know there was a level of anti-Semitism in the kingdom because we know what's going on over there in Judah and the opposition to them rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. So being known as a Jew might not have been great for Esther's future. So Mordecai said, keep your mouth shut. Every day, Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. Before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments. 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. That evening she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem where the king's wives lived. I've got a footnote there for that term, second harem, or to another part of the harem. Okay. Okay, where were we? There she would be under the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. Yeah, it might sound like a big deal to go and make love to the king and be held in high position, but once you've done that, you might never see him again. And I don't know if the king loaned his concubines out. He might not have, and that would have been it for that woman. Esther was the daughter of Abihail, who was Mordecai's uncle. Mordecai had adopted his younger cousin Esther. You already knew that. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. Well, that's kind of a wise move. Here's the man who's trying to steer the king. He watches over the young women for the king. Pretty good idea he knows what the king really likes. So if you want the king to really appreciate you, let him tell you what to wear into his bedroom. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. Footnote D, Hebrew, in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth. A number of dates in the book of Esther can be cross-checked with dates in surviving Persian records and related accurately to our modern calendar. This month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar occurred within the months of December 479 BC and January 478 BC. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem, or the other part of the harem, and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when he lived in his home. Well, that's how women were brought up. Men are in charge, you do what they say. He said, keep your mouth shut. She kept her mouth shut. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, we'd already read about them. Footnote G on the Bigthana. Bigthana is what the Hebrew says, compare 6 verse 2. Who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Cruel execution, but execution. And if you want to kill the king and the king finds out about it, what can you expect? Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Now, some people will tell you that's because he bowed only to God, but it's not what the text says, because the text doesn't mention God. And, people bowed to the king in Judah all the time. That was not considered a problem. So I don't think that's the issue here. Mordecai doesn't like this man for whatever reason and refuses to show him respect. And that's dangerous. That can be very dangerous, because the king can do whatever he likes. And he just had these two men executed painfully. And now you're going to thumb your nose at the king's respected and honored official? Must have been a particularly deep hatred. And we're going to find out that that hatred is apparently mutual. Then the palace officials at the king's gates asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" Doesn't give an answer, though. They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the empire of Xerxes. Now, we talked about this story back when we read the story of Saul and Samuel, and of Saul's attempt to destroy the Amalekites. And Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And while Saul had killed most of the Ammonites, he had kept some of the best of their livestock, and he'd kept the king. And some people have interpreted that he not only kept the king, but he kept the king's wife and the king's son. And that at some point, as or before Samuel showed up and personally executed Agag, that Agag's wife and son escaped. And so now, all the descendants of Agag, the descendants of this son who fled with his mother, have this visceral hatred for Saul, and along with him, all the Jews, for executing their ancestor, Agag. It's not explicit here in the book of Esther, though. So all we do is we see that he's an Agagite, and that's the appearance of Agag elsewhere in the Bible. So it's a warranted conclusion, but it's not certain. It's just something that might explain what's going on here. So it was more than just Mordecai's disrespect. And Mordecai's disrespect may have been because Mordecai knew who Haman was, that he was an Agagite. And well, like I say, there's likely some mutual hatred going on here. So, in the month of April, footnote A, in the first month, the month of Nisan, this month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar occurred within the months of April and May in 474 BC. See also the note on 216, which we've already read. During the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, so this is about 9 years after the incident with Vashti, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7, nearly a year later. Footnote B, which 37b, as in 313, which reads the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Hebrew reads in the 12th month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. The date selected was March 7, 473 BC. Also see note on 216. Okay. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else." Well, that would be doubled down on in Nehemiah's day, which hasn't yet happened. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. Well, that's probably a lie, except to the extent that Mordecai was refusing to obey the king's command that he bow to Haman. But that's not all the Jews, that's Mordecai. They refuse to obey the laws of the king, so it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, well, it's just boilerplate fluff that you throw in to make the king feel good, so he'll give you what you want. Issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. I'll pay you, king, to get rid of these people. Apparently, he wasn't sure that his logic would be enough to convince the king, so he throws in a bribe. The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." In other words, he's offering the money, but the idea is this might be an expensive operation. I'll help pay for it. The king says, "Well, okay. Here, you take the money, you use it as you see fit. You see to what you're suggesting here and get rid of these troublesome people in the land." And Haman is not without, as we've already noted, support for his assertion that the Jews are troublesome people. Just as in later days when they would write to the king and say, "These people are troublesome and rebellious, you shouldn't let them build their city," and got the building stopped for a period of time. So, Haman gets permission from the king to do what he wants. So, on April 17, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated it. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, because if Samuel had killed the women and children, there wouldn't be a Haman, so let's do to them what they should have done to us, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7 of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. Now, it doesn't say it here explicitly. Did Haman reveal the identity of the people that he wanted exterminated? This is genocide. He's asking that the king order a genocide, and the king has gone along with it. And the order does specify the Jews, so apparently Haman did reveal to the king what the list of what the people he wanted wiped out were, and the king agreed to it. Remember, Esther hasn't told who she is, so the king doesn't know he's married to a Jew. But when the people of Susa see this decree, and they know the reputation and the contributions of the Jews, they're confused. They may not know the history between Haman and Mordecai, and they may not understand the seeds of this vicious and genocidal decree. Mordecai requests Esther's help. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. It would be particularly bitter because he must have had some sense that this was his fault. He thumbed his nose at this guy, and this is the result. And now he could be responsible for the genocide of his entire race of people. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. Well, yeah, Esther was his favorite girl out of all the maidens that he brought to his bedchamber. And he did make her queen, but being queen doesn't mean you get regular contact with the king. It's been a month, and she hasn't had contact with the king. He hasn't invited her, and she doesn't dare go in without an invitation. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Well, that's kind of an odd threat. Isn't he her relative? Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So, that's the story up to this point. We've reached the end of chapter 4. There are, I think, 11 chapters in this. Let's look real quick here. 10 chapters. So, we did spend quite a bit of time with Nehemiah 13. We should be able to finish the book of Esther next week, but we've reached the end of our hour and a half here. And so I think we'll call it quits at this point and just plan to pick up there next week. And like I say, most of you are probably familiar with this story. You know what's going to happen. But it is kind of interesting to read through it and try to relive it to some extent. So that's what we'll do again next week. And until next week then, again, 6:30 Central Time if you want to catch it live, but otherwise it'll be up on the group for about 30 days. At any rate, until next time, we say goodbye and God bless.